Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
José Casanova jedan je od vodećih svjetskih sociologa religije. Viši je suradnik u Berkley centru gdje se kroz rad fokusira na globalizaciju, religije i sekularizaciju. Njegovo najpoznatije djelo, Javne religije u modernom svijetu, postalo je klasik struke i prevedeno je na više jezika uključujući japanski, arapski i turski. U prostorijama Bošnjačkog instituta Adil Zulfikarpašić, Casanova za Al Jazeeru govori o ulozi religije u globaliziranom svijetu, aktualnim međunarodnim temama kroz prizmu religije i potrebnim promjenama u modernim društvima.
Mr. Casanova, is there a resurgence of religion in the world we're living in, or is it losing its importance in modern society? And if I can add, what factors and actors contribute to this?
It's both. It's losing its ground in some societies, and it's gaining ground even within the same societies, because it's not only societies themselves are divided by religious people and non-religious people. But in general, the idea that the more modern a society becomes, the more secular and less religious, is clearly wrong. This was the idea based on European experience, and it presupposed that the rest of the world would be like Europe. Even Europe, of course, because of migration, is not anymore so secular. But in the rest of the world, particularly the United States was always an exception, was always a very religious, very modern society. And most other societies, they modernize. They can become also more religious. And especially the globalized world forces rethinking of identities, communal identities vis-a-vis other groups. And so in this respect, religious identities become more visible. Most nations are too small to construct purely identities on the basis of nationality. So for the global context, you need larger identities, and religious identities play this role.
Do you think that modern, and speaking like this, those would be more Western societies, do you think that they tried to offer the, do you think that they tried to fill the gap of religion and failed in it?
Partly, yes. Secularist ideologies claim that the secular is what comes after religion, and we will not need religion. The idea was that religion was somehow an error of primitive humanity, and as humans become more knowledgeable and more democratic, more free, the need for religion will disappear. Of course, this is based on a very concrete historical experience of the Enlightenment critique of religion. At the moment when altar and throne, the kings and the churches were united defending their privileges. And so people aspiring to freedom and to knowledge felt that religion was a problem. But of course, this is a very, very short-sighted view of religion. Religion is much more than simply the alliance with political powers. But sometimes, precisely, we see precisely when religion serves to sacralize violence, whenever religion becomes associated with particular political powers and uses the function to sacralize these religions and this power. So this was the way in which the origins of Europe out of the religious wars. The idea that somehow at the beginning of modernity, you have the conflict between religions, and this was terrible for Europe, and so we have to free ourselves from religion. But of course, it's also a very, I think, short-sighted and probably wrong idea of what produced the religious wars.
I would like to come back to this, but before, can you share your perspective on the role of religion in shaping today's modern politics, and maybe touch upon, you just mentioned, societies?
Sociologically, we always have two theories of the role of religion. One is the one that Emile Durkheim, the great French sociologist, said the fundamental role of religion is to create societal integration. Religion gives the common values, the common ideas, that then serve to unify people into a society they call a church. And this is the fundamental integration of society. But this role of integration is usually the integration of the tribe, of the nation against the other. And this leads to conflict with the other. The other role of religion is the one that has been more emphasized by Max Weber, the role of fraternization beyond the family, beyond kinship, beyond the nation, beyond the city, to create greater communities of brothers. Let's say Islam is supposed to be in the religion of the tribe, becomes the religion of everybody beyond the tribe. So this role of fraternization beyond boundaries, beyond territories, is another fundamental role of religion, particularly in times of crisis. So today, in a way in which the nation state is in crisis, then people look for some identities and ideas that are transnational and can be global. And religious today, the religious communities are precisely those ummas, those ideal communities of people that unify people beyond borders and beyond political units. So in this respect, it's no wonder that in those moments of crisis of globalization, that those communities that have an identity beyond territories play this important role.
In that context, what is the obligation of modern societies, especially if we take into account this plurality of religion and the plurality of religious identities within these very now plural societies?
This is why we need secular states. We don't need religious states. We should not have churches that have a monopoly over a territory. Religion should become deterritorialized and open to, precisely because no religions anymore constrained within its territory. Islam is not only Dar al-Islam, much of Islam today, let's say, lives and grows and prospers outside. The same goes with Christian societies. So there are no anymore religious societies per se, or territories. Within each territory, different religious groups have to learn to live together. And for this, you need a state that protects both the right of individuals to believe or not to believe, and the right of religious minorities to be protected from the tyranny of the majority. This, of course, this is what liberal democracy and the secular state can offer. So here I'm not trying to sell those modern concepts of European societies as the model, but somehow each society will have to find a way to protect the rights of all individuals within that society and to protect this pluralism, which is more and more irremediable within modern societies.
Do you think there is a need for reform of these societies when it comes to a secularist approach?
Yes, yes. No European society was prepared to accept religious pluralism. All of them have to reform their constitutions. They have to somehow reform their ideas of how people learn to live together. And today there is a crisis of secularism everywhere, precisely because the idea that a secular state could somehow protect religion has proven wrong. So you have the need for reform, but there's no one single model. As a sociologist, I know there is no ideal model. Neither the French model would work in the United States, nor the US model in France, nor the Turkish model, let's say, in Senegal, or the Chinese model, let's say, in Japan. So each society has its own way of reforming itself prudentially, pragmatically, without claiming that one single model is valid for all of humanity. We should abandon these ideas because they are catastrophic. When you try to impose democracy upon people, you try to impose a particular form of organizing society, leads to catastrophe.
However, you know, we live in this world that you're just now speaking about, this Western, let's say, world. What critique would you have for these societies in tackling with, you know, new dynamics that have been happening in the past decades and that are, you know, for example, we are now, especially, we're filming this interview at the time of the war between Israel and Gaza. There has been, you know, there have been reports of rising Islamophobia and anti-Semitism inside of Europe, in the US as well, but let's maybe speak about Europe because this is where we live. You know, what's the role and responsibility of these societies to tackle, you know, religion, which is such a broader concept than just religion? It has to do with identity.
Yeah, the fundamental problem in our global world, our plural, and to be plural is based on mutual recognition. We have to learn to recognize each other as we are, not as we ought to be, and to recognize this plurality as a fundamental fact. Plurality itself is neither good nor bad. It's bad when you have an idea of unity and only unity, and then you want to destroy this plurality because plurality is viewed as an absence of unity, and then you impose unity and by force. Or basically the opposite when you want to be so open-ended that basically you do not accept the identities of others. So it's fundamentally, you mentioned the Israeli Arab or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I will be giving a lecture tonight on the religious dynamics of the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. Those are fundamentally conflicts of the failure of mutual recognition. Mutual recognition that has to be based on equality, not on one superior recognizing the other. This is the old great German philosopher Hegel that argued the fundamental problem of the modern world, the struggle for recognition. Historical subjectivity is struggling to be recognized, but to be recognized as equals. And then you have the struggle for recognition between master and serf. The master wants to maintain his domination over the other because this is the way they recognize each other as masters. Masters that dominate the people around them versus the people that were dominated want to become free individuals. So these subjectivities are not equal. And the question is, how do we come to a world in which these subjectivities are recognized as equal? Different, but equal.
I understood that then your opinion would be that it's a fundamental problem that the approach of most of the parties involved into this discussion on religion do not have this mutual recognition as one of the core pillars of approaching a problem.
Exactly. So nations cannot have the idea that I'm the superpower and have the right to be a superpower. And, or that basically, obviously in the case of, it's right against right, and then the question is, when you have right against right, you have then a process of negotiation of what is a fair agreement of how we can live together and recognizing each other as equals. And this is a fundamental problem. We know that in Palestine, this is a fundamental problem of recognition. You don't have to have the recognition of Palestine to deny the recognition of Israel, but you don't have recognition of Israel that denies the recognition of Palestinians. So the question is, how do we find a process of mutual recognition that leads to being able to live together within the same territory? Because unfortunately, those two people have to share this territory.
Will the change in this approach have to come from the religious institutions and leaders, or from societies and states, or from a dialogue?
From everybody. It's the religious leaders, but religious people. The religious people learn with education, learn their own tradition. We learn how plural our traditions are. The more you know the traditions, the more you realize how plural they are. It's only convenience, sometimes, of political powers. In Christianity, there were 4 gospels, not 1. And it's only Constantine the emperor that forces the bishops to come together and to enforce unity. The credo is enforced by the emperor, because if we are going to make Christianity the religion of the empire, we have to have a unified Christianity. We would not have 2 forms of Christianity. So this is what the attempt to impose unity from above through force. This, of course, creates then violence and creates real schisms. When people learn to live together without the need to impose a unity, usually people are able to have to coexist and to live together. It's only when somehow there is this idea that within a territory there could be only one true religion or one true group. We have centuries of coexistence of Jews, Muslims, Christians in the Iberian Peninsula in the Middle Ages. But then comes the idea of imposing a Catholic kingdom, and so you have to expel Muslims and Jews from Spain. In India, the religions live for centuries together, but then you have the mother nation state, and then you have the separation of Muslims and Hindus, and within Pakistan and India, so you have populations having to leave these areas and being massacred as they move from one territory to another. So it is this imposition from above, politicals, that leads to most clearly to religious violence.
So when you speak of this, we very often hear, especially in modern day and age, about instrumentalization of religion. And this is definitely something that's been part of modern and historical warfare, and that's been part of politics very heavily. However, let's speak about examples. So back in 2022, we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And part of it. It is a conflict based on different identities as well, and on conflicts between identities. I want to ask you about the Ukraine conflict and the role of the Russian Orthodox Church. How incremental and instrumental has the Church been in Russia's invasion on Ukraine?
It has been central because prior to 2014, let's accept the Russian Empire, the Russian Federation, and most Russian people never accepted completely the independence of Ukraine. They thought this is a catastrophe, right? And so they don't accept this is a normal process of post-colonial independence of people, but they think this is simply a historical mistake. And so prior to 2014, the Russian regime still thought that they could intervene in Ukraine through political elites, through the Party of Regions. 2014, when Maidan led to the expulsion of Yanukovych, the president, and the Party of Regions collapsed, what remained for Russia was the Orthodox Church within Ukraine, faithful to the Moscow Patriarchate. It became the instrument of soft power. And so from then on, also Ruski Mir, which is the ideology of the Russian world, originally was, for the way Putin used it, only protecting ethnic Russians abroad in the former Soviet Union. It was the Moscow Patriarchate that gave the ideology that there is only one territory, one language, one nation, one church, one state, and that this should be reunified. So this gives the ideological legitimation. Religion is very powerful because it has the power to sacralize violence. And so this is the fundamental problem. But religion also has the power to desacralize any violence. So sometimes the question is, which role are religious leaders to play? To ally themselves with political leaders that want to instrumentalize religion for their purposes? Or to criticize the way those leaders try to use religion for their purposes? So this is a fundamental choice which both political leaders and religious leaders have, but also individuals, all individuals. So this is a choice. Sometimes dynamics are such that once a dynamic starts, let's think of Yugoslavia. Obviously, many of those have become the leaders of those nations were all communist. They suddenly found religion and ethnicity, right? And they became ethno-religious leaders of their new independent states, from Milosevic to basically the leaders of all those countries.
You mentioned, now that you mention ex-Yugoslavia, while we're still on the Russian Orthodox Church, what about Serb Orthodox Church here in the Balkans?
There are similarities insofar as both live off this essential myth that this is Serbian territory and that there should be only this church within this territory. This, of course, the idea that Kosovo is our territory because somehow in the past this was where Serbian identity developed. So this idea, which is also like to Russian nationalism that says Crimea is ours because Prince Volodymyr in the 10th century was baptized in Crimea, the Prince of Kiev, right? So Crimea is ours because of that. They don't, or obviously, so this idea that there is an essential territory which is crucial for a people is one of the myths that religion can help to develop. And so there are similarities between Serbian imperial nationalism vis-a-vis its Serbian territory and Russian imperial nationalism vis-a-vis its territory beyond Russia.
So what would you then call, and how should we classify this combination of religion, ethnicity, and national identity?
Ethno-religious nationalism. So, and of course, nationalism is the most powerful secular ideology. But then the question is whether those nationalisms, in addition to their secular ideology, which all of them have, also link themselves to some ethnic religious identity.
You said nationalism, religious identity, ethnic identity, and then in the end, which culminates in a state. Those attributes you just described, and also you were mentioning the Holy Land, would that be how you would describe Israel as a state? Again, bearing in mind that all of these identities and ideas are deeply entrenched into the basic and first idea of the State of Israel.
The Westphalian system of nation states is based on the principle of cuius regio eius religio. it's the sovereign that determines the religion of the subjects. And this is the way in which the Catholic kings determine that only Catholics can be subjects of Spain, and Jews and Muslims have to emigrate. Unfortunately, when the nation state repeats itself beyond Europe, when the Ottoman Empire falls, each new nation repeats the same ethno-religious cleansing. Ethno-religious cleansing has been at the core of every process of modern nation-state formation. You had programs of Jews everywhere whenever modern nation-states emerged. And for this reason, you had to create a solution to what otherwise was the Jewish final solution, right? The Holocaust. But of course, tragically, when the Zionist solution emerges, it also emerges within its own ethno-religious cleansing vis-a-vis the population there, non-Jewish population, being Christian, being Arabs. So this is the tragedy. I remember when I, a few years ago, organized a conference to think of religious political ideas in the Mediterranean and see how within the Catholic Mediterranean, within the Orthodox Mediterranean, within the Jewish Mediterranean, within the Islam, Muslim, you have always this same dynamic. And it repeats itself even in places where you had relatively coexistence of these religions together. Under the Ottoman Empire, these religions could coexist.
I have to just ask you, because you spoke that there was religious coexistence. Let's speak about Holy Land, about Palestine, before the emergence of the State of Israel. And you just recently mentioned Zionism. So if there was religious coexistence between Muslims, Christians of all denominations, and Jews in historic Palestine, up until the emergence and creation of the State of Israel, what role did Zionism as an ideology play, and did it in ways hijack Judaism?
Well, Zionism at first is simply a secular nationalist ideology. It's developed as nationalism for the Jews. The Jews have no nation state, they need a national home. And this is Zion. But because if you will have a national home anywhere, then obviously it will be a Jewish nation. But Zion is a very powerful, sacred symbol of the Old Testament. And you make Hebrew, not Yiddish, Hebrew, the language of the New Israel, you cannot separate then these Zionist ideas to also be completely somehow embedded within traditional historical Judaism. At first, many of the Orthodox Jews were anti-Zionist because they thought that Zionism can only come from the Messiah, not from human.
There are still many today as well.
Well, they are post-Zionists. There you have the post-Zionist Orthodox Jews, of course. But originally, many of us thought that it's not for us humans to build Zion. Don't call it Zion. Call it the state of Israel, the Jewish, but don't call it Zion. Zion can only come from, in this respect, from God, from Yahweh, from the Messiah. But of course, we know that through the years, especially after the 6-year war, you have religious Zionism emerging. And so you have now, this is a tragedy, for me it's a tragedy in the sense that the Jews were the first global deterritorialized diaspora religion that could find a place everywhere in the world. And then when it tries to find its own home, it repeats there what they have suffered wherever they were as a diaspora. So the question is, how can we create a situation in which you have precisely modern democratic nation states that don't make this clear distinction between first-class citizens and second-class or simply non-citizens? And so this is part of the problem, yes, when Zionism is mixed up with modern nationalism, because then it's not anymore Israel, it's Eretz Israel. It's the land of Israel. And of course, Eretz Israel is not only the land of Israel according to the Constitution, but it's all of Israel. And once you have these sacred notions of a sacred land, it becomes very difficult to share a sacred land. That's why the only solution, I mean, the Vatican has been saying this for generations. Jerusalem can only be a free city for the 3 Abrahamic religions because it is the holy city of all 3 religions. And therefore, the only solution is that this city doesn't become precisely part of a territorial state, but has to have its own identity free from a territorial state. So these are issues we'll have to grapple together precisely in our globalized world.
So with all of these obstacles in modern societies and global politics happening at this moment right now, do you think also that, you know, religion is maybe often disregarded in speaking about main global issues? Because throughout our conversation we touched upon this, that religion is also part of the ethnic identity, it's part of the national identity, it's part of culture. Is it often disregarded from the perspective of these modern societies as, you know, something that is passé or not relevant enough?
This is true, but on the other hand, we have to recognize that today, the people who are at the forefront of dialogue and recognition are usually religious people. While modern societies, democratic societies, are totally polarized and cannot live together in democracy. You have the Pope going to the Gulf states and signing this letter with the Mufti of Al-Azhar, and then you have signing a similar letter with the Shiite leader of Iran, or actually it was in Iraq, and you have Jewish leaders, religious leaders, who are at the forefront of interreligious dialogue with Muslims, and Muslims at the forefront of interreligious dialogue with Christians and Jews. So I think that we have to recognize precisely that within religion itself, in the same way that it was within religion, people like Gandhi, Martin Luther King, they used the resource of religion to precisely create models of nonviolent civil disobedience to go against injustices. In the same way, the religion has this way of desacralizing violence, fighting for justice but without violence. And this is a fundamental lesson we have to learn. How do we can fight for justice without violence, because violence will only bring further violence. So, and this is religion is the great contribution that precisely religious beliefs can contribute. Fight for justice without violence. Justice and peace, peace and justice. There can be only peace with justice, there can be justice with peace. And so let's fight together. And I think that this is a message which, in the 20th century, we see the struggles for justice led by religious leaders, Gandhi in India, Martin Luther King in the United States, Desmond Tutu in South Africa, that are able to address those problems which appear almost insoluble.
Mr. Casanova, thank you very much for joining Al Jazeera.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.